So I want to begin with this question. In both your book and the Truth article, you reframe piety not as an interior belief or doctrinal submission, but as a practice structured through temporality, repetition, and relationality. Why was this reconceptualization of piety necessary? And what does it make visible that older anthropologies of Islam did not?
Well, I mean, it's certainly in the tradition of the work of the category of religion, which centrally within anthropology, especially was the work of Talal Asad. Asad's, seminal argument was that the domain or category of religion presupposes certain liberal and secular assumptions about what religion is, what counts as religion, what doesn't count as religion, and then later, right? And that this kind of emerges as a feature of secular ideology or liberal ideology, and thus as of modernity, and that and later that this becomes a kind of under secular regimes, which we tend to normally think of as being neutral towards religion, but in fact, Asad argued that it turns religion into an object of regulation. So out of that tradition came a series of important anthropological works, the very famous works by Saba Mahmood and Charles Erskine, that all looked through the paradigm of Foucault's idea of ethical self-cultivation, looked at that embodied practices are means through which within the Islamic tradition, the idea is not that Islamic practice is not just like a representation of an already given self, a prior existing self, but instead a means through which the self is cultivated and created. I think that I do make a critique of the Foucauldian paradigm because I think that sometimes, and this is not, I don't have an overtly harsh critique of it because, I think that the Foucauldian framework sometimes reduces piety to a kind of individual acting on themselves. I don't think that's entirely fair to both the works of Saba Mahmood and Charles Erskine, but I do think that in some way that work backgrounds the dialogical, interactional nature of pious, both self-formation and community formation. And so my book is an intervention into that, and I add, I think, to this Asadian paradigm. I both critique it, but I also add to it this kind of, like locating piety in its interactional forms. And I argue basically that when we look at the way that the religion or the sphere of religion is constituted within its religious movements, Islamic movements, right, we get into the sort of particularity of the ways in which both selves are constructed, but also religion as a domain, deen, and this sort of difference that I examine between deen and dunya within the Tablighi Jamaat, how that is institutionalized. On the basis of that, we can understand the political valence of such movements. And so that is the overall aim of the book, to understand the interactional basis for the creation of piety, pious selves, and pious community formation, and what I call pious relationality, the way in which people interact with each other and understand themselves to be part of the world.
Thank you for this introduction. And I want to begin with your engagement of Talal Asad's notion of tradition as a discursive formation. But you emphasize aspiration, moral striving, and ethical possibility far more than stability and continuity that's seen in Asad's work. Where do you see yourself extending Asad's legacy, and where might you depart from it?
I think that within that legacy, sometimes what happens is that the notion of an Islamic tradition or discursive tradition becomes too kind of reified. Now, I don't dismiss there are certainly some people whose critique of Asad is that the notion of a discursive tradition. Well, maybe I'll say a little bit about the notion of a discursive tradition that everybody's not familiar. So Asad famously argued in an essay, I believe it's Towards an Anthropology of Islam, where he lays out this idea of a discursive tradition, and he argues that a discursive tradition is a tradition of a Muslim practices relative to a sort of past, right? So the way in which people in the present create a relationship to the sacred past by drawing on certain forms of sacred sources that authorize a particular practice in the present. And I actually think that that's a fairly reasonable way to understand tradition, right? But I think that sometimes what happened in this work as it moves into anthropological studies of actual Islamic movements is that tradition takes on this really sort of overarching, really heavy, I think, presence, and it already predetermines the types of movements and the types of things that should be the objects of analysis, right? And so I think that I work from what I would call a more ground up perspective. Is I argue for a semiotic perspective that allows us to tease out the micro practices through which subjects are formed and particular visions of community are created. And I do think those fit in a broader Islamic tradition because, of course, they're drawing on some of the means of the past. So I think that that ability to ground the Islamic practices in interactional space opens up some space to think about community formation and interactional forms, ideologies of sovereignty and collectivity and so on. That
I felt your emphasis on this aspiration, failure, and ethical becoming in relation to your research subject, which is the Tablighi Jamaat, adds this forward-looking dimension. In a way, you seem to move from the tradition as tradition as continuity, but tradition as a possibility. Does that shift a signal of a new kind of moral anthropology in your mind?
I think that's an excellent point on which I think there's space for a good amount of discussion and debate. I think that there's some sense in which the notion of tradition foregrounds continuity in that literature, and a lot of anthropologists drawing on that tradition. And if you look at religious studies and the way that Asad has been popularized in religious studies, very important, interesting work. I think that you do get a sense from a lot of that work that there's a lot of sort of continuity between the colonial and pre-colonial and modern and pre-modern past. And there's this sort of like, even though Asad's argument is presentist, Muslims are making and remaking their tradition in conversation with each other and creating this linkage to the past constantly. When you really get into the work, it does feel like there's a kind of argument of continuity. And I feel like my work has sort of departs from that, in that I'm really interested in the way that modernity reformulates. So I feel like I'm more of a change person than a continuity person.
Yeah.
And I think there's space for all of us in this kind of debate about what these movements are. I do make the case that there's a way in which what is being formulated within the Tablighi Jamaat in terms of ethical subjectivity, community formation, all these practices have a greater indebtedness to secular modernity and modernity than has been, at least in some of that literature, been recognized. And that it shares kind of, the modernity shares things with other modernities. Joel Robbins, the anthropologist Joel Robbins, said that, we sometimes talk about vernacular modernities in a lot of literature, but nobody actually says, well, what's the modernity part of the vernacular? We focus on the vernacular, but what are the things that connect the modernities that make them modernities? And so I actually emphasize that point, that there's this notion of a direct relationship to transcendental power that a subject, an individual, a person can formulate. How we formulate that direct relationship to transcendental power is subject to all kinds of questions of community, tradition, and political economy. Like, what is it that people are trying to achieve when they lay claim to transcendence? So I end up with this kind of argument about modernity and modernities and the piety formation of the Tablighi Jamaat as a particular variant of a broader thematic that runs across modernities, including Christian or Jewish or even secular. And so my interest is in that more comparative dimension of modernities that emerge in the colonial period and the historical chapters of my book about the rise of these modernities. So I think that's also a site of a bit of a tension between my work and that work, to which, as I always say, I'm a friendly critic in the sense that I actually respect that work a lot, and I drew on it as well. So I'm not one. There are definitely certain people who are much more dismissive of it. I feel like I'm trying to engage that work on its terms, and I depart from it in these particular ways.
You present the ethical subject not as coherent or completed, but as perpetually becoming. Why was it important for you to foreground the ethical subject in this manner?
That's a great question. I mean, I do think that the type of subjectivity that is being imagined, the type of community and subjectivity, both that are being tried to imagine, are very elusive, right? I mean, there is a sense, again, linked to my notion of as a modernity, of this purification of the sphere of religion and of these other aspects of life, which are constantly then frustrating that project. So it's like this object that people are chasing after, aspiring towards, but is a very difficult thing to realize because it does the level of commitment that it requires. And so I think that maybe the way to think about it is that I have both a sympathetic and a critical take on the Piety project, which is I recognize the work it does in people's life, in the way that it reformulates their sense of place in the world and so on. But I think it runs up constantly against limits that threaten and challenge it. And thus it requires enclosing yourself from people that are, for instance, different from you, that threaten your piety. So piety is something formulated, but is also something constantly threatened by these other potentialities that exist in Pakistan, this diversity, of plurality of possibilities of being Muslim, of being non-Muslim, or being all these other things, in terms of ethnicity, caste, and all these other possibilities. And so I think that there was a general, if I could just broaden the point I'm making, is that there was, against that same literature, that Asadian literature, there was a kind of critique that came from what comes to be known as everyday Islam. I lay out the kind of parameters of this debate within my introduction. And with that criticism was that there's almost too much emphasis on Islamic tradition and Islam in Muslim life, but actually there's so much more going on in Muslim life. And I think that that's fair, right? Like we know from our experiences in a country like Pakistan, Islam is this ever-present thing, but it cannot be the, right? There are all of these other potentialities of subject formation and stuff, and other modernities that compete with that. And therefore, not just secular or liberal ones too, the things that run through the book, saint veneration, right, and Sufism, and other formulations of the transcendent in different maslaks and different denominations of Sunniism and Shiism and so on. So Pakistan's an immensely plural place. So I think that why I wanted to emphasize those limits and that difficulty and that striving, but also the contradictions and difficulties of materializing that vision, is because people move in and out of movements like this, and they are constantly subject to frustrations and limits, and sometimes people entirely abandon them, and sometimes people. So I think that once you ground the tradition sociologically, and you find that many possibilities emerge. So people are trying to enclose this notion of piety and this purity idea of a pure religiosity, but it's frustrated by material realities and other possibilities of subjectivity, conceptions of
Yeah,
subjectivity and sovereignty.
I want to dwell on Dawat for a second. You show that it isn't simply a sermon or form of persuasion. It's a material embodied practice of ethical invitation. How do Jamaat members learn to do Dawat, and what kinds of ethical relationships does it create?
This is, at the center of the book is really a kind of micro-analysis of these processes, right? And ritual processes of Dawat. I make an argument, one, that we cannot understand subject formation without understanding the kind of institutional structure within which that people produce in practice, right? And so Dawat is more than a practice on the self of the individual. It actually formulates a whole, the scholar reads, Dietrich reads, called it a faith bureaucracy. There's a whole bureaucracy structure that is produced in the Dawat, that organizes the Dawat, which in turn then formulates the subject as they practice this Dawat. And so I focused on hierarchical arrangement. So the Tablighi Jamaat is an egalitarian formation in the sense that all Muslims, or at least male Muslims, there's a sort of gender hierarchy. The women have a whole realm that they also participate in, right? That all Muslims technically should participate in this, because this is the practice that God has bequeathed to humans to create that relationship to transcendence and to cultivate faith, right? So they call it the mother of practices, ulama, right? It's the practice of practices. And so that idea is that any Muslim who wants to cultivate faith and create a relationship to transcendence must partake in the Dawat as a embodied practice. But in that process of Dawat, I argue, even though there's this egalitarian premise, it creates these ranked hierarchies, a hierarchy between new companions who haven't done a 4-month tour and old companions. And there's a whole kind of symbolism around these thresholds of difference, of pious ascendants. So I look at the institutional structure of that process where you preach to others, but you also become a listener to those more pious than oneself. So you're supposed to preach outwards, and that's supposed to shape you. They say when you preach to others, it creates those virtues in yourself. But in the process, they also formulate this kind of institutional hierarchy. So I got really interested in this question of the hierarchization of this structure through which one creates a relationship to transcendence. So
Mhm.
one of the arguments I make is that Dawat is a practice of self-cultivation in relationship to others, but it creates these kind of layered, tiered connections to the divine. And then also that then there's a practice of, this is why there's such a strong emphasis in the Tablighi Jamaat on collectivity, on the Jamaat, right? Which is
Mhm.
the preaching congregation. And so congregational life is so important. And in congregational life, one comes to be a pious subject by recognizing the authority of those more pious than oneself and indexing that or citing that in everyday practice. And so there is a conception of agency that defers the agency of this to the other and creates these kind of relationships of hierarchy that I describe in the kind of crux in the center two chapters of the book. And I argue that there's a notion of pious companionship in the Tablighi Jamaat in which one defers. It's a kind of practice of deferment, an awkward term called the ethics of hierarchy. I could have called it ethics of deference or whatever it
Mhm.
is. It involves deference to others, and it involves deference in two senses. One is to literally defer to the authority of those more pious than yourself, and you have to learn and cultivate that ability to recognize piety in others or virtue in others, but also to defer the project of the realization of pious authority to the future. So you don't want to assume too much authority you don't have yet. And so this idea of the disciplined self that can defer to those more pious than oneself, but also defer to the future when you're unable to realize that piety in the present. So it's this constant process of pushing the realization of the moment of piety to the future. So it's looking forward constantly.